week 6 of Research and Information Skills. This week we're looking at the question of how do academics converse in print. The subtext really is regarding what academics actually do, and if you'll have a look at the session outline, that's precisely the first point that I raise. The other three things that I talk about or want to discuss in this presentation is the questions and processes in academia, certainly, and lend some weight and some light to academic debate, and also the building of knowledge, which is a little bit more arcane. However, before going further, I'd like to kind of congratulate all those who actually get their assignment in on time. Remember, the 19th is the day that it was due. And most of you should see results within 2 weeks or so of the due date. Sadly, you have a fairly limited time between this assignment, the one that you've just handed in, and the next one. I'd recommend that you all begin to look at what you actually have to do for that assignment. If nothing else, familiarise yourself with the actual process and the demands or requirements. And the sooner you understand these things, I guess the sooner you can start. I would personally feel that you should begin to, begin the work perhaps during the break, or at least straight after the break, just to make sure that you can make the deadline. It's fairly involved on some levels. It involves a lot of trudgery. By trudgery, that's a combination of trudging and drudgery. That's a new word. But for me, like I said, that the fact that the work is, I guess, in some respects, it warrants some sort of methodology for actually undertaking the actual work. Anyway, I won't fumble through this intro anymore. I'd like to move on directly to the PowerPoint presentation. So the first question I pose on slide 3 is, what do academics do? And generally, we work within universities. We have combined duties, and by that I mean we often have research duties or obligations. We have teaching and administrative duties. I have to say, for me personally, administrative duties is sometimes the most tedious, but often the most needed in terms of keeping up with students and where they are. And to state the obvious, academics play a central role in university, because without the academics, an institution couldn't function. So if we didn't have lecturers, for instance, we couldn't hold classes. So essentially, academics, literally are the heart and soul of a university. At its most basic level, academics, in terms of admin, have to prepare course materials. We have to mark assessments that come in from students, and which sometimes is interesting, because when you've received early assessments, you begin the marking process, you go through the due date, you have a central pool of marking that you may have, but you also have late entries, so people who've had extensions, for instance. So the marking period for assessment can go up to anywhere up to a month, even longer, depending on the extensions that are allowed. The other things that we do is record student achievement. So in other words, when I do mark assessments, I need to record that somewhere, and that obviously goes towards your results. One of the big part for me, and particularly in my role, is student consultations. I spend a lot of time talking to students. I find this, certainly the pastoral aspect of my job, to be the most fulfilling. It gives me an opportunity to get to know people, to have, or establish relationships with my students. And even though at times it can be time heavy or time demanding, when I'm very busy, I still always make the time for my students. Not because it's necessarily an obligation, but more because I value that above all other duties that I do. There's other general administrative duties that I may do, which are too tedious to go into here. The other thing that academics do, and I think probably the most important function outside of pastoral care, is preparing and delivering lectures and tutorials, and obviously preparing and marking assessments. These aspects of our jobs happen in the background, and they're often very time involving. We end up using a lot of our time to generate even a single lecture. It may take a week or so in development. You put that across a course, and then you've obviously add tutorials to it. It can be very time intensive, and this is something for me that I actually enjoy when I have the time and the space to do it. But often in any sort of teaching role, and I say that right across the whole sphere of teaching and education, you often don't get the time that you need. And I have to say, and I guess maybe I'm sounding like a bleeding heart here, but a lot of the work gets done in our own time at home. The research component of our work usually involves us undertaking projects. So in my case, I'm involved in a link project, which is it's a pilot project looking at how students, that is distance students, can be served or can utilise the links, which are in nearly every sort of major town in Tasmania, and how distance students can access those links and have someone there who is deemed to be a mentor, who was trained by me or someone else in our team, and they can assist and help those students who would otherwise not have face-to-face support. This goes for all the peers, or their peers who come along to these particular group meetings, and what ends up happening from that is we end up writing a paper and discuss the aspects of that pilot program and attempt to put it out to the wider community in the hope that other people may also take on these particular ideas. It obviously widens our understanding of a particular area, say in this case distance learning in pre-degree programs, but it also highlights certain problems, certain issues that other people can work on in different ways. And obviously it generates new knowledge and validates existing knowledge, which is fundamental to all research. Research that we do undertake is presented in a range of different ways. It can be presented as a conference paper, where we go to a conference and present our material or our findings in journal articles, obviously book chapters and books, and that's where the further you go up in the academic chain, the more likely you are to have been published in all of these formats. In fact, you have an obligation to be publishing work in these particular, or down these particular avenues. Now, without going into the intricacies of slide 8, what I would say is that the statement in bold, an academic argument begins with a statement that is debatable, an idea that the author believes, but which other people could potentially disagree with, is really the starting point, the fount of where academic debate starts. So in other words, people pose or present an idea or a theory on a particular thing, and then people comment on it. And that commentary is part of the development of that theory. So over time, people will either renounce or perhaps change, modify, transform a particular theory into something that appears more credible. And I put an example there about experts coming together to look at water use in rural Tasmania. And what you'd find is that generally people have very different and often unique opinions, and all from very different backgrounds, about a particular issue, and each will debate that issue, and then hopefully through the process of academic debate a solution could be arrived at, which is generated through the process of argument. And by the use of the word argument, I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I mean it simply in an academic sense. Now on slide 9, I offer an activity about if you had to examine a contentious issue that was in the press at the moment. If you went through an evaluative process, so first of all you put down the main points of the argument, you then looked at the evidence for each of those points, and then literally weighed up each side of an argument, you would hopefully come to some sort of resolution, some sort of point which was, I guess, the most right, if one could use such poor expression, that or possibly better expressed as the most plausible answer to a particular situation. Now what happens in class, inevitably we discuss this as a group, and if people come up with sort of counter positions, we go through the process within class about trying to work out in a debating atmosphere, or an atmosphere of debate, what appears to be the best answer to this particular situation. The 4 main points in academic argument or debate is that the claim must be arguable, so in other words that it has to be a legitimate point of view put forward, that an argument must be rational, so it's based on fact, not emotion, that the logic of the argument or statement must be cohesive, and the other thing is it must be part of a process of referencing, so however that particular argument or position was constructed or built, it must acknowledge the sources that underlie it, that are the substrata of it. Now in slide 11, I outline some of the reasons for academic argument, and I'd like to go through those point by point really. obviously the reasons for an academic argument include things like supporting something we think has merit, so in other words a position. So equally like us in our private lives, if we believe that someone perhaps should change their opinion or their ideas or their actions towards something, we will pose our opinions and with any luck influence change perhaps. The other is persuade someone that something would be beneficial to do in terms of a particular course of action. And again, this kind of could be equally modelled on our personal lives. Another point would be convince someone that something is true, likely to be true or probable, which is self-evident. Show someone the problems or difficulties with something. And the last one is reason with someone to get them to change their mind or their practice. All of these have a flow-on effect. They influence one on top of the other, as far as I'm concerned. And once you mention the word about persuasion, persuasion is an instrument that's used within newspapers, for instance, to actually galvanise public opinion about certain things, as you'll see with the newspapers with the election. There's a lot of posturing going on, as with any election, and obviously that's in an effort to hopefully sway voters to vote a certain way. On slide 12, I look at what a good argument should contain, and it should contain a clear position, with obviously supporting evidence, and this would go for any academic work. Obviously acknowledge counter-arguments and counter-evidence, so in other words that it would demonstrate that you've been partisan in how you've actually approached a particular issue. Use the right language, and I've put discourse markers, in other words jargon to some extent. Explain what the evidence shows, so actually illustrate your understanding or demonstrate your understanding, of the evidence you're presenting, and draw out the implications and what possible recommendations there might be, and draw out the conclusions that fit the argument. So in other words, through a logical process we can come to, when I say we, I mean the audience, can come to a similar position that you have, or at least understand how you got there. The two activities that I've put on the slides, from 13 to 19, I'll let you go through that process if you want. I would hope that you will engage it to some extent. These are worth at least exploring, even if you don't have the full benefits of being within a group. If nothing else, the ideas that come out of them are important. Moving on to the development of knowledge, so from slide 20, what I want to focus on is development of knowledge around sociology. For some people this may be completely alien, but the process itself is the same no matter what the discipline. All disciplines have a starting point, so have a founder figure, so in other words someone who wrote in that area or initiated that particular theory, etc. And from there we have development, so people, as I say, go through academic argument, academic debate about certain issues. They add to the body of that knowledge through that process, and then we arrive almost miraculously sometimes at an end point where we look at the material today and see it often through a lens of common sense, and yet through its development it perhaps wasn't common sense. It was something that was literally being identified perhaps for the first time, and then discussed and rediscussed over time, and debated, and as I say, revised, transformed over time until we get to a position today. Having said that, there's no static point here. Even though we may find a provisional endpoint, most theorists, or theories I should say, are under constant development and redevelopment due to different perspectives being taken across disciplines sometimes. Anyway, to sociology. If you have a look on slide 21, I literally pose and put forward the chronology of the perspectives in sociology. Each were a migration on from another. So if we may have started with symbolic interactionism as an orphaned sort of offspring of psychology in a sense, and the view of society and the individual within society, and the focus was literally on the individual. And we moved then through to functionalism, which had a fairly benign view of society and the structure of society and how it influences the individual, down to Marxism, which took a conflict approach, which maintained that the social structures that are enforced through the classes are ultimately weighed against the masses, that most people, or in Marxist terms the proletariat, are forever under the yoke of the bourgeoisie, in other words the wealthy and the elite. and that struggle should be maintained and resisted. Not the struggle itself, but obviously the class system. Then we moved into feminism, which was literally came about in the 1960s, earlier depending on your kind of view of the development of feminism. But from the 60s onwards we have a substrand not just of Marxism being feminism, because feminism deals with similar issues within society, although there's a very strong Marxist stance or position by feminists. But there's other strands too, obviously. But its focus was inevitably on patriarchy, on how women receive a poorer treatment in society than men do. Now these developments themselves take in, 100, 150 years of thought, of different people looking at different aspects of society and commenting and debating about what those things might mean in terms of how we interact with society. So we have a starting point, symbolic interaction, and we end up with feminism. Now feminism isn't ultimately the end point. There's lots of sub topics or areas within sociology that are being explored and not necessarily comfortably off the main strands or the main perspectives. And so sociology is obviously a developing environment of theory and practice and obviously research. But if I was to look at one aspect, and I'll go back to the start, to symbolic interactionism, from my perspective this has a lot to offer in terms of how we understand our own positions in society, how we understand the notion of agency, and by agency I simply mean that by me having choices in my life and operating on those choices, so do I take choices or not take them, and that I do determine my behaviour rather than the structure, rather than society determining what I do. I have a much greater scope for choice and assertion of my individualness. Two very different perspectives. If you look at functionalism, for instance, which would suggest the individual operates within a broader structure, and yes, there is a certain level of agency, but it's within a broader context, whereas symbolic interactionism simply believes or posits that how I interact with the social forces that are around me, i.e. family, friends, work, education, etc. Those things, as through my interactions, those things give me a sense of self, and without it I wouldn't have that sense of self. The key phrase here is about the construction of self. So how, and as I've put on slide 23, how individuals construct their sense of themselves and society through language or symbolic interaction provide the foundation for a theoretical perspective. That is the mission statement or the underpinning statement for symbolic interactionism. In other words, the most important thing is the individual, and it is their interactions through symbols. In other words, that's why it's symbolic interaction, through symbols, that we then not only discover meaning in the wider society, but also find or discover a sense of self. And this is the position. However, if you look at slide 24, we look at how symbolic interaction changed through time. So we start off with George Herbert Mead, who presents a particular statement, in this case subjective aspects of social life. He begins to identify and discuss and theorise about how subjects, or us, as human beings, as individuals, how we interact with society and how that might actually influence who we are. And then we go through a progression of different authors, so Bloomer, Goffman, Becker, Ritzer, just to name a few, because there's many others, who have added to that body of knowledge. In other words, not only do they confer a certain level of agreement with Mead, and some don't, some obviously either transform or change what Mead said, or at least add to it, and sometimes they renounce it. But anyway, nonetheless, they have become part of the authors that are the collective. So they are the theorists behind symbolic interactionism. Each of these have added to the body of knowledge around that particular perspective. For the sake of argument, I've put in the criticism of symbolic interactionism, so on slide 25. Now these particular issues or criticisms that were raised all had to be addressed, and still are being addressed by certain scholars within this particular field, and these criticisms cut to the core of symbolic interaction, and whether ultimately it's a coherent perspective, and one that actually has a sound logical base. And as you'll see on slide 26, through criticisms and the debates that these generate, you can see how theory literally over time changes or is transformed. Theories either literally live and die through this process. So if there is at some point a critical error found in the logic or reasoning behind a particular theory, and that's exposed at some point, then obviously a theory will die away. The process will die quite quickly, as I've put in the word demise. However, if it continues to have some sort of cogency, some sort of coherence, then what you find over time is that the theory, and through its development, becomes stronger, more critical, and certainly reliable in terms of its actual statement. As part of this process, if you have a look on slide 27, I look at how knowledge is built through a scientific method. Now, academia follows a similar method, albeit slightly different depending on the discipline you're in. Each have their own methodologies that they use, and certainly have different mechanisms at their disposal. However, much the same thing as in terms of the process is undertaken in different disciplines. Slide 28 outlines how the process, so in this case I've used the 5 authors that were on the previous slide and looked at how they might actually interact via print. So what you might find is that certain authors at different times address issues that have perhaps been brought up in the past. Sometimes they ignore the past. Well, that's probably a bit too strong, but they may tip their hat to the past but not actually go into it too much, because what they're actually attempting to discuss is not necessarily that easily linked to past ideas. However, what you do get is often a jumping or a hopping of authors where they're addressing issues past and present, and in different ways. And these particular processes or processes are literally the normal standard of discourse amongst authors. So, like I said, certain issues will be addressed while others are ignored, or at least omitted to some extent. And usually these things occur as a backdrop to critics or criticisms of a particular theory. And as you'll see by the arrows, my attempt is to actually illustrate how over time a theory develops through certain authors, and those authors address certain points from previous authors or current authors, and through standard criticism from outside that particular theory, or even within that theory base, that discipline, you'll get a development and almost an ironing out of the issues, particularly if there are serious issues that need to be addressed and understood. This whole process is, I guess, can be simplified to the point that if we were looking at an argument, say for instance if we were in a classroom looking at an argument, there may be people who would address certain issues that other people have said from previous classes, for instance, who may address issues directly towards either the lecturer or to other students within the room, all the time being aware of criticisms that have been levelled at certain positions. And this is the whole notion of tutorials, that often we present material in the classroom and then put it up to debate, which is what my hope is for most students, which neatly follows on to the task for the tutorial. I'm hoping all distance students can have a look at slide 30. For the first part of the tutorial, I would like you to consider the fact that there's articles that suggest that 13% of academics admit knowledge of data falsification. What this means is that academics are actually changing or manipulating data that they've got and to suit their research ends. And 3 questions that I'm going to pose in the tutorial, which maybe you'd like to consider and perhaps respond to on the discussion board. What are the wider implications for building knowledge if research is being falsified? 2, what safeguards could be put in place to prevent the falsification of research? And 3, can we really trust what researchers are saying? Now, I'm not necessarily taking a negative, a hyper-negative position towards researchers, because I think most researchers, for the majority, work hard and do their work honestly, but there is a percent that don't. And the fact that 13% of academics admit that they have falsified data perhaps would suggest that the numbers are a little bit higher than that. But having said all that, what are the implications? That's the key here. What are the implications? The second thing that I'd like you to do is read through the abstract from the PDF file, Misconduct Abstract, but also read the Guardian article about academic publishers make Murdoch look like a socialist, and read the Journal article, Falsifying Evidence. Obviously, number 2 and number 4 relate to the first tutorial that we deal, because I do them in 2 halves. The number 3, or point 3, raises some fairly serious issues, and like I said, I'd suggest you read the article. And the questions that I'm going to raise in the tutorial are: what are the primary reasons for publishers of academic articles acting the way that they do? So we're looking at maybe some sort of defence or justification for those who publish journal articles. The other question, or one of the other questions: should all academic research be freely available to the public? In other words, if I'm undertaking research in a university, should that be available not only within my university but all other universities, and even to the public? And the last one is who should be the gatekeepers of academic research? So who should be allowed to publish and release the findings from academic research? Should it be the government if it's important? Should it be arguably the media, or could it be just universities? I'll leave that up to you to decide. Anyway, time is running out as always, and no doubt you have as much to do as I do. Anyway, have a great week, and as I said earlier, maybe begin to look at assignment 2, just maybe a backwards glance, so to speak. Anyway, enjoy your week. Thanks for listening. Bye.